Hi, good afternoon, everybody. This is Ram. I would like to welcome you to the session, which is a new unit, which is Managing Continuous Organizational Improvement. This unit is a common unit in the Level 7 Health Management and Level 7 Extended Diploma in Strategic Management. So some of you who have joined this session today will be covering this particular unit for the next few weeks, jointly. Now, in terms of the overarching aim of this particular unit at level 7, primarily in the case of strategic and healthcare management, is that you need to be able to have an understanding of how change happens within an organization and what creates change, why the change is required, and then how does the organization continuously innovate and use the change models in the organization or in a business to keep improving, say, for example, quality of service, for example. If the organization is manufacturing products and services, then they need to continuously be able to strive to improve service and service levels that they provide in terms of their products and services to their customers. So what we will be looking at doing in this particular unit would be covering this across sessions. It's got 3 LOs, and what I'm going to try and do is for each of the LO I've created a presentation, and we're going to go through the overview of the learning out in the session, and use a few slides to be able to present how you're going to approach and look at the key indicative content, which is what we need to be able to understand to say that we have studied this particular unit. Now, starting across with the first outcome, I hope you're able to see my screen and hear me clearly. Now, any questions that you have, just stop me there, and then you can ask the questions through the chat or ask questions during the session. Now, in the first learning outcome, what we're basically looking at is going to understand how organizational culture and structure are related, and how the structure and culture of the organization actually creates the environment or encourages the environment to bring across change within an organization. Everything in this unit that we will still actually be related to a concept CQI, which is improvement, which is basically called continuous quality improvement, CQI, as I mentioned the term. And the idea would be that most organizations do not stand still, and they continue to improve on their services, they continue to improve on their service levels, or anything which is related to their products or services, so that they're able to better serve customers and obviously look at getting more increased business. Now, let's look at the first aspect before we get into the nitty-gritty of the learning outcome. Let's understand how you define change. Now, change is defined as a process through, it could be a continuous or non-continuous process, but it is essentially a process which basically brings across a string of, in this case you will primarily see that there is a string of activities which happen, and these stream of activities which basically happen bring across a process. Let me not use the word change, but bring across a process wherein the organization or a person, in this case, moves from point A to B, or from, say, one location, or you move from one particular position to another position. Now, a simple example that I would primarily give out would be that if you have a newborn child or a baby in your family, what tends to happen is as the time matures, as the time goes on, what you will see is the baby begins to grow. So he'll become a boy or a girl. Obviously, if it's a girl, it'll get into teens, and then obviously she becomes a mature adult. So this particular process through which the entire thing happens could be termed as something called a change. Now, if I have to relate this to how and why is it that we are studying this particular change, we need to relate it to a business or an organization. Now, because organizations do not stand still, the organization is growing. Sometimes we hear of these terms, and the organization is growing, the revenue is increasing, the number of people working in the organization is increasing, And in that case, we tend to see is that there is a change. It's a form of change which is happening in the organization, wherein or a business that it is going from A position to X position, or from one side to, say, for example, growing in terms of size, growing in terms of people, in terms of financial turnover. Now, this is what has changed. Now, if we see this as a series of steps which are happening, then this is a continuous change, that the company is increasingly making profits. It's increasing its customer base. So it's a continuous change, but it is reflecting positives of that change. So continuous improvement is basically an ongoing process, and every company tends to implement this process from a long-term point of view. That means 12 months, 18 months, and this process, which basically leads to the improvement of products and services which the company sells or a business sells, is nothing but continuous improvement or continuous improvement process. This process happens over a point in time. It is gradual. There is a small incremental, change which keeps happening over a point in time, and that is why this process then becomes, a continuous process. Now, let's understand very briefly a couple of things with regard to understanding, what is organizational culture. Now, the basics that we look at, talk about organizational culture. It basically reflects your business or your company's mentality, your work ethics, the values of the company, or what the company believes in, and that is what normally would reflect if we say what is organizational culture. Now, some companies would regard this as in terms of a culture and bring it into a code or an employee handbook, and what they would say is that, okay, our employees follow this code of conduct, and because of which the company has this particular culture, or the firm or the business has kind of a culture. Now, sometimes you get to hear these terms that the company has a very family-oriented culture. That means it's a family-grown business, or there are lots of people in the family which basically started to work in the business and are continuing to work in the business. Sometimes they say the company has a very professional culture, or it has a very professional outlook. That means the company has set processes which basically allow it for it to function and deal with a lot of customers. Not to say that the culture is different from, but these are different connotations that we get to hear when we hear the culture of the company. Sometimes you also hear terms like the company has a very professional, work-oriented culture. The company has a very people-friendly culture. The company has, for example, a very customer-focused culture. Now, these are qualities which the business reflects, or the way the business interacts, the employees work within the organization, and that kind of tends to define the culture of the organization. Now, if I have to look at a definition after understanding that, what we are going to say is that the organizational culture is nothing but a pattern of shared values, beliefs, and actions which are appropriately put forward by employees or one and all in the organization, and that tends to portray a particular type of image or a particular type of ethic for the organization, and that would be what we define as organizational culture. Now, there are different characteristics of the culture. We just cannot say that the values, ethics, morals, the code of conduct are culture of the organization, but culture of the organization can have different characteristics. Sometimes you will see companies which are young companies or startup companies, as we do get to see, they have a very risk-taking culture or risk-taking ability, higher risk-taking ability. People which work within the organization in the initial setup tend to be more, risk takers. And that is why it leads to innovation. So, for example, some of these startup companies that we talk about, like Uber, Facebook, they all had a very high, ability within their initial set of employees to be able to take risks and bring about innovation. They believed in an idea, and that is why, they had the ability to be able to take large risks, which they convinced investors of, and because of which the companies were able to bring out innovative products and services. So, characteristics of the organization could be things like innovation, risk-taking ability. It could be attention to detail. If you look at a college or a university or a teaching or a learning organization, there the attention to detail is more important, and that is depicted in the culture of the organization, because everybody looks at everything in the full stop, comma, in detail, attention to detail. There are other types which we could define briefly as the outcome in terms of orientation of the organization, the people orientation of the organization, team orientation, how aggressive the organization or employees within the company are, and what is the stability which the organization is able to provide to its employees. These are all characteristics of, organization cultures. Now, if I have to give you two variables, say organization A or a business A or business B, what do we get when we look at these two types of contrasting cultures? So here we talk about things like, managers in organization A would document all their decisions, but in organization B, they might not document all the decisions, take decisions from their gut. In A organization, they will look at, creative decisions based on brainstorming, thinking, meetings, and then look at also creating a list of risks and risks associated with bringing across that change. You might have rules and regulations. Productivity is valued from all employees, and employees are encouraged to stay within their own department. That means they're encouraged to basically perform their day-to-day operations, and individual efforts are encouraged. On the other organization, you have risk-taking, more of risk-taking. There is an acceptance to failures. That means they encourage employees to take risks, and because of which, if failures happen, they learn from those failures. They're called learnings, have to be done. Employees follow a few rules in this case, because what they are doing is, maybe the organization is in the initial setup phase. Productivity is balanced by a higher achievement in some employees, and sometimes you get to see that rewards may be team-based rather than individual-based. So we can see that there are two different types of organizations which exhibit two different types of cultures. Now, if I have to kind of say what is organization A, maybe they have a very people-friendly or a very kind of work ethic-related culture. If I look at organization B, they tend to be more of a risk-taking organization or a startup, wherein the culture is primarily to look at developing, taking risks to develop innovative products and services. So sometimes you will see characteristics of the organization also influence, how the culture of the organization is. And if I have to kind of summarize this in this chart, it basically says how organizational culture forms. So you basically start with the philosophy of the belief of the owners and their, belief in terms of why they're setting up the organization or the business. They look at certain criteria of how the business will be considered successful, not successful. The kind of people they recruit into the organization, and in terms of how they delegate roles and responsibilities, and their core beliefs then translate into the employees' core belief, and then that is the organizational culture. Culture has various functions. The reason I want to kind of explain this here is that because the culture of the organization, it does not management in this to exercise control to be able to bring across change. And in some cases, when we talk about things like, structures of the organization, which I'm also going to come to, they will then allow the managers to not only control and bring change, but also mean that they'll be able to bring across, people within the organization, which are able to then, kind of implement the same culture and, the change in the organization. So you will see that the culture is important is because it kind of acts like a social glue and holds the organization together. So there are common beliefs amongst the people who work within the company or the organization, and that is why it binds them together, and it is primarily termed as a social glue. Now, in some cases, when the organization, what we do understand from structures, I don't think I have anything on this slide here in terms of structures. But when we look at structures of the organization, we basically come across, 5 different types. So we talk about structures, of the organization, which are things like democratic structure. We include structure of the organization, where we would say this. When we talk about structure, we'll go to the types of structures and the leaders which they have. But just talking about, the structures of the organization, here we are talking about things like, whether it's a flat structure of the organization where the workers have the access to the top management or the owner of the organization. We talk about hierarchical structure. We also talk about divisional structure. We talk about matrix structure. So here, different type of structures come across in different types of organizations because of their size of operation, the number of people which work within the organization, and in terms of how many geographies or locations the organization actually functions in. So the culture of the organization impacts to a certain extent the culture of the organization. And here, the cultural impact on the structure could be, looked at from a point of view of understanding, say, common legislation. And a current example that I would take here is that if you know that the recent scandal of the Cambridge Analytica firm, which has happened, wherein the analytics and the AI behind the company, or the basic product of the company, was actually used to exploit data of 89 million users to influence them and bombard them with information which may have kind of then persuaded them to take a particular decision. Now here, if you see, the culture of the organization was that people's personal data or sensitive data could be used to basically look at business or marketing reasons. So in this case, what has happened is, if you see, the company has obviously, because this involves data, people's personal data and information, here the company has to act morally within the grounds of understanding the data protection and the rights and individuals' rights and the demands of the individuals, and then use that data appropriately. But in this case, the company did not use that, and because of which you have seen that Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO of Facebook, company which owns Cambridge Analytica, was then summoned by the European Union and also by the US Senate to offer reasons or explanation in terms of why these breaches happened. So here in this case, what has happened is, because the organization is quite huge and large and functions across different continents, they are also influenced by common legislation. So what we do get to see is that the culture of the organization was such that it promoted innovation, and because of which proper checks were not made, and regulation was not followed, which allowed these breaches or lapses in terms of the information being used by the firm to market or for commercial reasons. So in this case, what tends to happen is, when you look at such a large organization, and in some cases it's been proposed that the organizations, Microsoft, Apple, Google, should be actually broken up. And the reason why they are saying is that these companies need to be heavily regulated by government, and procedures have to be put in place so that they become compliant with law or the law of the land. Now, this is especially true that we get to see in the case of financial institutions and the recent, the financial crisis that we've had in our living memory. Some of us would relate to that. And what we do get to see is that, because there were lapses after which led to this financial crisis and the recession across the world, now a lot of changes are being implemented, not just within the structure but also within the culture of the organization, especially in the case of banks or financial institutions, that these kind of mistakes should not happen and cannot let these mistakes happen again. So when we look at that, we can see that there is a clear correlation between the structure and the culture of the organization, and I think that is much more clearer from this financial institutions example of how the banks, when you look at RBS, they've been broken up. Some of the RBS has been forced to give up some of the operations of the bank, and the idea is to allow the company to be able to, a large company like RBS to be able to comply with the law of the land, and also introduce legislation so that these kind of mistakes do not happen again, wherein the bank had to be bailed out. Some of the banks had to be bailed out by the taxpayers' money. Now, when we look at this particular relationship between the culture and the structure of the organization, what we do get to see is that, because some of these organizations are large, even in small, medium, large businesses, what we do set to see is that why this has been done is to bring across a change, and change can only happen over a point in time. So when we look at some of the changes which have to be introduced in these organizations, the change has to be introduced gradually, because they are looking at introducing this change to be able to bring things across in the culture of the organization, and culture of the organization then shapes the structure of the organization. So sometimes when we look at suggesting changes in terms of changing the culture of the organization, what we talk about is having the top management become more positive role models. So when you see the CEO of Uber had to resign, the reason why he had to resign was that there was a case brought against him, and as the top person in the organization, he was asked to resign because of a case of basically sexual harassment, brought against him, and he said that we do not tolerate this kind of thing in our organization. So Travis Klasnick had to resign. So he basically set an example as a positive that the top man in the organization resigned because he clearly felt that this is something which the company does not stand for, and he had to go. So when you look at bringing the change in the culture in the organization, sometimes it has to start at the top, or the extreme top, which is the top management, the CEO or the chief executive. Now, you will see that within the organization, what happens is, in order to bring across this change, a lot of organizations create code of conduct, ethics, employee handbooks, certain collaterals which basically then depict this particular change in philosophy or the change which is documented. And then this is basically through the process of institutional socialization brought into the organization over a point in time, and this then reshapes the values and the beliefs within the organization to bring across a change. Like one of the things which you can correlate to is very clearly that in the run up to the after the financial crisis, what we did see in the run up to the financial crisis, we did see that the banks kind of promoted a policy of bonus or reward system, which meant that the investment bankers or people working within investment and merchant banking were allowed to take large risks in order to bring more business to the banks. And that reward culture basically led to the creation of a toxic debt, which a lot of banks were not able to recover from either the mortgage or the lending which happened by most of the European banks in the US. So in order to bring across that change, sometimes what has to happen is the culture of the organization has to change, and that change can happen gradually. And that, for us to be able to bring across that change, we will look at, studying one or two, change models. So one of the models that we look at is Kurt Leaveins, model of change. I've got a slightly different presentation, which I'm going to go through very quickly, but this is something which I'll upload on Moodle, so you can also see as a bit of a backup. Now, Kurt Leaveins was essentially, a person who he was a pioneer who studied, the concept of change within organizations. So in the early 1940s, he came across, after a lot of research, he came across with a model, which is a 3-step model and is named after him, which is called the Leaveins 3-step model of change. And this basically meant that, he did certain social experiments, and through which he documented this as a model. And there are 3 steps to that particular process. One is unfreeze, the second process is change, and then the third process is refreeze. Now, the 3 processes basically talk about, we need to understand and talk about the rationale of change within the organization to employees so that they're able to accept the change, why it is happening. So the first process talks about unfreezing, talks about communication, talks about talking about and spreading the rationale of change, why it is being brought across. And then the other concerns which are related to, okay, if this change happens, what will that mean for me? And those, kind of fears or, questions are quelled in the employees and staff's mind when they're looking at introducing or bringing across change. Now, when they look at taking it further, they provide more information, which could be looking at, like frequently asked questions or, a lot of questions which sometimes staff end up asking, and, there are different ways through which they're addressed. And this then is, kind of slowly and gradually filtered into the staff and the employees within the organization. And once this has been understood, there could be training development, there could be, a gradual shift which could be brought across in the way things are done within the organization. And that part basically talks about, the process of, kind of unfreezing and then bringing the change in the organization. So there are lots of things which can be done in this case, and in this case, basically, managers or leaders in the organization talk about, what the information, they provide a lot of information which talks about the changes being brought across and how these changes will help move the organization forward, make the work easier, make our jobs easier, or make the, provide advantages to the role which employees play within the organization. The third step or the third phase is called refreezing. That means in order to bring that change, sometimes you have to dip into looking at use of technology. So they will try and implement new systems within the organization. Say, for example, HRM, a lot of companies today, because they have businesses across different geographies, they introduce systems like CRM, which is customer relationship management system. Now, there might be a lot of, as an example, when something new is introduced, there might be a lot of, non-acceptance from the employees, because they have to do increased work to be able to understand the system, and use the system. But at some stage, when the documentation, training, and development is provided, a lot of employees become more, positive towards accepting that change. And once that change has been accepted, the process of actually transitioning into that change starts. So the implementation of new systems, and obviously, in some cases, it might lead to, some employees being made redundant, some employees being, hired. So that resistance is overcome during the process of moving. And when it is finally done, then the process talks about defreezing. That means a phase in which the change has been brought in, and that change then starts to exhibit behaviors, primarily from the staff and the employees within the organization, to ensure that they're more accepting that change. And that is where this particular 3-step model actually comes in. So in order to summarize, it shows that the employees are ready for change. Information is provided at the unfreeze stage. Change stage basically talks about executing the change, bringing the change, and then refreeze brings about, reinforcing the fact that the change is going to create benefits, advantages for the employees of the staff in the organization, and they talk about the benefits to ask people to embrace and start gradually accepting that change. So when we talk about culture, in short, just to summarize, culture brings across the development of structures within the organization, and when both of them work together, they are required to bring across change within the organization. Now, there are lots of change models that we need to study, and this particular presentation, which I'm going to send across on the email and also upload on Moodle, will talk about, two models in particular. The one is the Leaveins model, and the other model that I'm going to talk about is Cotter's 8-step change model. Now, John Cotter, obviously, he came across with this particular concept, and he has been researching, in the field of leadership in particular, and how leadership can bring across change within the organization. So, with this kind of studies he did, he looked at this 8-step process, which he outlined, which allows the organizations to bring across change successfully within within their organization. So, by implementing the 8-step model of what it did, it allowed the organization to bring or transit successfully a particular change into a business or a process or a department or the whole organization. Now, having to go from there, what we're going to try and now see is we're going to try and understand, in terms of the second part, which is understanding how leadership comes into play. So when we talk about, the things like when change is happening within the organization, you could look at various things like, change could be brought across, bringing, things related to culture, the structure of the organization. But the other aspect which is important is leadership. So no change can be introduced within the organization without the leaders endorsing it, or the top executive actually endorsing the change. Now, before we go into this part, let's look at a few brief definitions. Now, refresh the concept of management. So when do we say, or what do we mean by management? Now, management basically, if I have to define, basically means that anybody who's in a position who manages people, would be looking at, being in the management position. So if I talk about anybody who's let's put it this way, the process through which we bring across, say we deal with or we bring across change, could be dealing with management. So process of dealing with or controlling things or people would be something which would define management. Now, if we look at leadership, leadership is basically defined as a process or the ability which some people have to be able to create an environment or influence others within that environment, wherein the individuals working for you are willingly, individuals will willingly work for you within the organization. So when we talk about, leadership in particular, we can talk about leadership in various aspects today. So it's very difficult to define leadership in particular in terms of definition, but the plain simple meaning of leadership would be to look at, actions of a particular person or a group of persons within an organization which can influence or ask you to willingly do things to the best of your ability would be defined as, the concept of leadership. Now, competence is nothing but knowledge and skills that you have to be able to do your job. And commitment sometimes can be referred to as loyalty or commitment, which is the motivation, the passion, the willingness that you have, or the confidence you have to be able to do your job. Now, let's look at understand leadership styles. Now, there are different leadership styles that we read, over the years, but there are basically 4 types. So we talk about the direct leader, we talk about the team leader, we talk about the supporting leader, and we talk about the delegating leader. Now, they can also be defined as styles which sometimes we are more into hearing, which could be things like autocratic style of leadership, bureaucratic style of leadership, laissez-faire style of leadership, or we talk about democratic style of leadership. So when we talk about directing, it could be something more to do with autocratic. When we talk about coaching leader, more of democratic. When we talk about supporting leader, more of laissez-faire. And when we talk about delegating, it could be either a combination of somebody who's people-oriented or somebody who's a bureaucratic leader. So these styles also. The reason why I summarize this here in 4 slides would be to understand when change has to be brought across into the organization, you have to have leadership and management styles also influencing that change. And that is why we need to study and understand that sometimes you will see different management styles and different management and leadership styles help facilitate continuous change or improvement within an organization. And the leadership style or the management style is actually required to embed the change within the organization. So sometimes leaders bring across that change, but after change has been brought across, you will see that within the organization, they would normally tend to hire somebody who will be a people's-oriented person and would gradually bring that change into the organization. But sometimes you see that change agents or people are hired from outside the organization to come in, project manage and implement that change. But once that implementation and the introduction has been done, you will then see that people, in the more democratic side of management style or democratic leaders are then allowed to take over so that they are able to then listen and also have all the ears to the staff and employee and then still continue to work that process of bringing that gradual change. Now, the last thing that we look at when you bring across change, when we talk about companies having, things like, you buy a certain product and you pay a certain price, you expect the product to be of a certain, quality. The word that we are looking at saying was you buy something and you pay for it. What you expect in return is that you want to get the value of money for what you actually paid for. But in other terms, what we are looking at saying is you're expecting certain quality. Why do you buy a X type of car as against a Y type? In some cases, you're influenced by the fact that the brand, the quality, and the promise it delivers in terms of its service is higher in terms of your, expectation, and that is why you even in some cases go out and pay a bit of premium. So when we look at that concept of, quality, what we want to be able to do is understand what does that mean, and why sometimes change in organizations when it is brought across is also reflected. In order to maintain that change, you have to then maintain it from a point of view of, ensuring quality going forward. So quality is important, and when we understand the meaning of quality, it basically, has different connotations, but here it is a degree of excellence of a particular thing. You could also have, certain features and characteristics or certain values or certain type of deliverables that you expect that product to deliver. And the last thing would be that you have your own perspective of, what quality is. So, for example, you buy something and you expect that thing to last for 2 years, 3 years. That is your expectation that, okay, if I buy something worth 20 quid, I think it's going to last me for 2 months. Like in the summers, a lot of us buy, table fans, or, you buy a fan and you buy a cheap fan just from Tesco's for the summer. You buy it for 10 quid, 20 quid, and you expect that to last you for a season. If it, doesn't last, then your expectation is, okay, yeah, the quality of the fan was not good, and maybe I should have bought something which is slightly better. So quality has different meanings, and here what we want to understand, the context of quality will be to try and understand why this is important when we talk about the concept of change within an organization. Because once the change has been introduced, you want to be able to maintain that change, to be able to deliver that benefit to the customer in terms of either a product or a service. So this slides basically explain, quality, and I'm just going to briefly skim through this because it's much more of a reading to understand the concepts of quality, what are the different quality systems over the years we have come across, and why at every stage, and now at every company at some stage starts to focus on building quality in terms of either its delivery, in terms of its service, in terms of the products it provides, or in terms of the turnaround time it provides if you're a service-oriented company. So quality is nothing but a commitment, which sometimes you will see that the companies will ask for when they employ you with the organization. One of the clear things which comes across in the contract is that they will ask you to basically reinsure that once you work for this organization, you are to be committed to delivering things in a particular fashion, which is nothing but quality, or trying to achieve customer delight, which is nothing but quality. You're trying to provide the best service to your customers when you represent the company, which is nothing but a commitment that they want, and that commitment is directly or indirectly related to quality. Now, when we talk about quality, there are lots of different quality systems over the years which have come up, and I'm just going to go through some of the slides to try and show you and talk about a bit in terms of each of the system. Now, there is something called TQM, which stands for Total Quality Management. Now, Total Quality Management as a system came about when it was believed that everything revolves around quality. Everything that you do has to do with quality or certain type of output which it produces, and that output has to meet certain expectations which have been set in, say, for example, when you're manufacturing something in the process manual. Now, principles of total quality management revolve around being customer oriented. That means you look at everything from a customer's orientation. It also talks about the principles relate to leadership. They lead to a lot of meticulous planning which is required to bring out a product, manufacture a product, offer a service. There is a key role which the employees of the staff play, because their roles and responsibilities actually end up producing the output. There is the process of continuous improvement which is put into place so that you can continue to improve the products and services that you provide. They seek cooperation from each and every individual in the organization who's involved with that process. And there are some statistical methods to measure this in terms of total quality management. And a lot of companies focus on giving training and education in order to keep improving this process. Now, when we talk about quality, here there are lots of things which are mentioned in the indicative content. It talks about Kaizen, which is Japanese principle of maintaining quality, which came across from Toyota Motors essentially, and they introduced the systems like just in time and Kaizen. You also have something called PDCA, which was introduced, and again it follows something which is related to quality. Then CQI, which is continuous improvement, and we look at Six Sigma benchmarking quality circles, 5S, for services and things like that. Now, Kaizen was a Japanese word, and is a Japanese word which basically means continuous improvement, and is a long-term approach, which most Japanese companies take, and they work through systematically to be able to achieve small incremental changes in their processes to be able to improve efficiency and quality within the manufacturing. So most Japanese companies that we look at, which came across after the World War II, we look at the likes of Sony, we look at the likes of Toshiba, Matsushita, Fujitsu. These companies basically came up, even the car manufacturing companies like Toyota, Nissan. You look at all these Japanese companies, Suzuki, they came across with the concept of continuous improvement. But Kaizen, basically the word means continuous improvement, and it was put into practice by Toyota Motors. And they also brought across certain other terms that we'll get to hear, things like just in time, to save inventory costs and other things. And they brought across some of these systems. Now, in terms of understanding the process of quality and continuous improvement, we need to look at a few key things to understand how this is implemented, how does this work. Now, I I have kind of summarized in the slide the Deming's 14-point quality improvement system which he introduced, the PDCA cycle which talks about plan, do, check and act kind of cycle, which is the Deming's wheel that he came up with, TQM, which I've talked about, which is total quality management, and in the last, what I will also look at is Six Sigma. Six Sigma is more of a a concept which basically originated from GE or General Electric as a company, and they basically came across with this concept wherein they talked about they talked about a particular discipline or a philosophy which was data driven, and it talked about the concept of eliminating defects around the 6 standard deviations when they look at either manufacturing products or whatever it is. And this then primarily conformed and came out as an idea from manufacturing. And here is the here in the American companies, when they started this, they started the concept of Six Sigma, which was the the 5 phases which they talk about in order to bring across continuous improvement in the quality of the products or services that they were introducing. So the 5 basic concepts actually talk about things like they first starts with the identification of the problem, then they look at definition of the problem, how the problem can be measured, the problem can be analyzed, and then how the problem can be improved and controlled. And this then particularly became something called Six Sigma. Over the years, this process has got refined, and there is something called Lean Six Sigma as well, and that process wherein the improvement and has been included in this process is then called the DOMAP, and that is an acronym which is currently relevant when most manufacturing product companies look at put this into place. And when they introduced this concept, they talked about the concept of Six Sigma. That meant that in order to bring across change in the quality and continuous change in terms of improvement in quality within a product or service, they said that they had the concept of wherein you have leaders who could be people who are defining change, and then the structure which was put in essentially. So what they said was there are people who understand the whole process. Say in a project, if it's working, the project leader must be a black belt or a Six Sigma. And then the supervisors or managers should primarily have at least a green belt. And in some cases, what they said was, in order for the team to be able to bring across a change, they had to have clear roles, and these roles had different understandings in terms of how they were brought together. And then the concept of the introduction of belts. So you have green, yellow, and black belts in Six Sigma. So introducing became the process of that. And here they was to define the problem, measure the problem, analyze the problem, or the process in which the problem was occurring, and then how it could have been improved. So put project leaders in, black belts in, or people who have had previous experience of working in such projects, and then how once this improvement was brought across, how to control the process so that you do not have these defects happening again. And when we look at that, there is another concept we came across, in the European context, which was the International Standards Organization, ISO, which introduced a set of procedures and policies, and these are recognized internationally, and they are an international certification now for suppliers and manufacturers. So there are different ISO certifications, and they are all related to quality, documentation, processes, and over the years, this has become a very reputed system which is internationally followed for quality certification of suppliers in particular. So in short, if I have to summarize, in today's session, what we looked at primarily is understand what creates a culture of how an organization actually brings across a culture of change. How does it start? It starts from the culture, then culture leads to the creation of a structure, and once the structure has been put in place, then we look at the process of change which can be brought across by leaders and managers within the organization. So here, key concepts that we've looked at in today's session is to try and understand, why is organizational culture and structure important to bring across change in the organization. What are the characteristics of culture, how it affects the structure, and how it affects the change being brought across. And then to underpin this particular concept, what we have to look at is we have to understand the change models, which is the Kotter's 8-step model and the Leaveins 3-step model, to understand how change is brought across managers. So when you work as managers or supervisors within the organization, and we talk about a simple thing, if you're trying to bring across a change, how would you bring that change across? You need to know how change can be implemented and what is the role of leadership and management in bringing across that change. These variables play an important factor in bringing change. And then change is not something which is, which can happen immediately. Change is gradual. It is, it is incremental, and the process of continuous change that can be across by using systems or creating systems which adhere to quality aspects. And then we know the models through which change can be brought across and implemented, and how this can be introduced within the organization. So I'm going to stop here for today, and this would help us cover learning outcome 1. Now, as a bit of feedback, what I'm going an additional reading, I'm going to send across a particular handout, which basically is a few pages, and this relates to how change can be managed within an organization. So this would be a good read. And then the second presentation, which I'm going to send across, would be a presentation which basically talks about in detail about the change models, to get a bit more perspective on the theoretical aspects of what we want to be able to cover in learning outcome 1. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask me now, and if not, then you can email them to me, and I can come back to you with some additional supporting documents for reading to clarify those questions. Once again, thanks for joining the session today, and I will catch up with you in the next one, where we'll actually continue on our journey to study learning outcome 2, and in that we'll be basically looking at how humans can be brought across by various activities done within the organization. So for the next session, we have it planned for Tuesday, and that will be at the same time, which is 7 in the evening UK time. Thank you. Bye for now.